So today let's talk about holds, specifically textures and what makes a good texture, what certain root setters are looking for in the different styles that we do. I wanted to talk about this today because I got a question on Instagram yesterday from a guy. He was specifically asking about the dual texture XL pinch. And the question that he had was, is the dual texture just for aesthetics, or does it make this hold harder to use? Like, is there an actual functional purpose to the dual texture on this hold? So, what do you think? Is there a functional purpose to that dual texture? What is it?
Well, if you put it vertical on the wall, it's not a foot. You can't use that as a foot.
Yeah.
Stand on it.
Yep. If you set it vertically, it's going to be really, really hard to stand on. You could still heel hook or toe in on the side, and if you're a root setter, that helps you force a very particular type of movement. So yeah, for the most part, all our dual texture across everything that we do, we aim for functionality. It's nice if it's pretty, but if it's not functional, if it doesn't help force the movement, then there's really no incentive to having the dual texture. It takes a lot more time on our end, a lot more effort and resources to make it nice and pretty. And so if we're just doing it to make a pretty hold, it's not really worth it. So we want to make sure that it's both pretty and functional. So when we think about dual texture, this is the Legacy Moon. So this is actually from DRCC, so a company that we acquired over a year ago. It's a company that went out of business a while back, and they had really great shapes that were known for their dual texture and really functional. And we see how it kind of fits in with our current line of dual texture. And what we see sometimes with other companies is they'll do like dual texture strips, things that look pretty but that don't actually add any value to it. And so for us, it's really important that the dual texture has a lot of functional value. So that's dual texture. We like it, root setters like it a lot because it helps force very specific movements. If this hold was just solid, simple texture like this, then I can use this whole backside as a foot, right? And so I might have some unintended consequences as I'm setting with this hold that I can't foresee all the variables. And as a root setter, we don't try and force movement, we try and encourage movement. And the way that we encourage it is by saying, well, if you do it in this way, it's going to be easier than if you do it that way, right? And so the dual texture really allows us the ability to tune into that and say, you're going to be incentivized to do it the way that I said it, rather than making up your own sequence through. With simple textures like this, it's a little bit harder to predict all the different scenarios in ways that a climber might break beta. Okay, so that's a simple texture. What about something like the Crater series? Is this aesthetic or is it functional? This is actually, do we have a Crater Sloper? Crater Sloper might be a stronger example of this.
There's one that's not colored, I think, right up there, top left.
Top left. Oh yeah. This guy. Okay. So let's talk through first. These are both from the Crater series. Craters on this one, are they aesthetic or are they functional?
Or it's usable surfaces that make that pinch.
Yeah. So how does your hand rest on this hold typically?
On the pin.
Yeah. Show me. Yep. So if you guys notice, his hand is not actually touching the Crater texture. And that's how that hold's designed. It's designed to be grabbed like a pinch in this way so that your fingers are nestling on either side of the texture, so you're not actually using the puckers for the grip itself. How about the Crater Sloper? Same series, but different hold. Now where are you using the Craters? You tell me. Yeah, now they form little finger pockets. So now you're encouraged to kind of like explore the hold a little bit and try and figure out where the good spot is. So this is an example where the texture is more aesthetic than it is functional. And this is where it's both very aesthetic and it's incredibly functional because the puckers are actually what you're climbing on. So if we look at the history of root setting over the years, maybe about 5 to 10 years ago and even earlier in climbing, we see a lot of textures and things like this. This Sting series from Friction is a really good example. This was shaped maybe 15 years ago at this point, and the textures themselves are designed to be grabbed and to be climbed on, simulating outdoor real rock conditions. where you might get some really strange textures that can be sharp sometimes, but for the most part, you're climbing on those weaknesses of the texture. In maybe like the last 5 years, we really have seen a big movement towards more simple textures where it's maybe aesthetic, but the usable surface itself is a little bit more forgiving on the skin. And that's just a reflection of how root setting has kind of progressed over time. When we shape a texture that is going to be designed to be used, we want to make sure that it's really comfortable, first of all. This is one of the issues that like old shapes would really suffer from. So the sting pockets, it's a great hold, but it's kind of sharp. It's a sharp hold. It's a function of how old it is and what it's for. Some people really enjoy that. Some setters don't enjoy that. Just it's a difference of taste. For us, we want to make sure that everything's nice and comfortable and it feels good on the hands. So that's how the Crater series kind of climbs, even though they're the same. There are a little bit of differences there. Now, how about something like the sandstone chain head? Is this texture functional or is it aesthetic?
Kind of a little bit of both.
Mhm.
You have a very severe jug, but at the same time placed in the right condition, and that those little lines make a big difference.
Yeah, it's kind of riding that line between the two. Honestly, I would say the texture is probably more aesthetic than anything. Your fingers can kind of catch in these grooves, which gives you a little bit better grip as you're in like steep climbing. It's designed to be a good jug, so we want it to kind of grab you back. But for the most part, the texture itself isn't going to add anything like super different. If this had been a fairly smooth hold, it would probably climb about the same. But sandstone is a really fun texture. Sandstone is one of the, I'd say the 3 most popular types of rocks that you can climb on outside. Can you name a different one? Granite and limestone. Yep. So limestone, granite, sandstone. Those are kind of the big 3. Sandstone's a really fun, easy one to duplicate in terms of texture. So pretty much every company out there has a sandstone series. Every company out there has a granite series. And the limestone series is a little bit harder because limestone can it can form in a lot of different ways. So it's not so iconic when you do a limestone series. It kind of just looks different. It can look entirely different. So yeah. Now, as a root setter, if you were brand new to climbing and brand new to root setting, what type of hold and texture do you think you would be attracted to personally? You're not?
The aesthetic.
The aesthetic? How about you? When you look at this, what would you look at on the wall and say, like, that's the most interesting? I want to go grab that. I want to climb on that thing. This guy? Yep. So for those of you at home, this is Sam. Sam's not really, I'd say, climber per se, but this is the perfect example of like a new climber coming into this sport. They look at this, and this looks really visually interesting and compelling, and so they want to climb on this type of thing. Quite often we'll see like the Crater series or things that just have a lot more texture to them. That's what really draws new climbers and new root setters specifically. And it's because it's so visually interesting. You put it on the wall and it's just like stands out, like that's neat. As you progress in climbing, specifically as root setters, you see people start moving like Sean did towards the dual texture. And the reason is this allows the root setter to have ultimate control over your experience on the wall. If I set this hold, I can't control where you grab it. You might grab it here, you might grab it here, you might grab it here, and in each one of those instances, it's a different experience, it's a different route. Whereas with this hold, I can force you to grab here or here, it's pretty much the same. I can make sure that you're not going to cheat and use it with the other hand. So it allows me as the root setter a lot more control. I don't know if there's like an equivalent in art with sculpting or painting or drawing, where maybe paint by numbers.
Yeah, or even like materials you use. I think people like to start out on acrylic and watercolor, and then oil takes more finesse.
Mhm. Yep. So that's kind of the textures conversation. Do you guys have any questions?
I'll weigh in on the dual texture. So I think it's interesting that they asked about, like, is this aesthetic or is it just functional? And they probably picked the one hole that has like the most intentionality into it. And so if you got, it's probably hard to see, but if you look at the texture, and so the grippy texture comes up and then it cuts through here. A lot of times this will continue all the way to the tip of the hole. And because the dual texture covers the entire tip, like all the way back to here, what that does is when you put this vertical, if that texture came all the way through, an advanced climber could get their toe on that texture right here, and even sideways. And so pretty much we've maxed out this whole tip and the whole back, you know, so no matter how it's set, it's really hard to get a foot on the top. Okay, so if you set something like this, or in this case, the texture line runs all the way to the tip, I can put my toe right there. Obviously, it's gonna be harder here, but I can get my toe there. And so on some of our newer dual texture, we'll come in and we'll wrap it right on the tips. So we're like really masking that out, because that little difference is the difference between the route setter knowing that they can't cheat here, and then they get to put a foothold here. Because if you could toe in right there, then it's, you know, it's a slightly different movement. I also, with dual texture, the other thing I would say is I think it's always functional. And so it's like, is it functional or is it just aesthetic? And in the sense that our industry is moving more and more to color-coded routes, when this is purple, when it's completely chalked up, it's really hard to tell the difference between this and a black route. Okay, like purple and black look really similar. So even if it's like aesthetic, like it's always going to be functional when it comes to like route reading. And so that's the other benefit is no matter what, if you can get dual texture on it in some way, it's going to at least at a bare minimum be functional as far as being able to distinguish, you know, some of the harder colors, especially like, what are the harder colors? Orange and red, purple and black, are those the main ones?
Black and gray.
Black and gray, yeah, and so the dual texture can be helpful in that sense too.
Because the chalk doesn't stick to the, right?
Yeah, because the chalk doesn't stick.
Any other questions?
Difficulty of making dual texture?
High.
High.
Very high. Yeah, the amount of time and energy that goes into making a dual texture hold is quite a bit higher. The amount of life that you get out of the mold is quite a bit shorter, so all across the board, the expenses are much, much higher. We've spent a lot of time and invest a lot of energy and resources into creating our dual texture line and maintaining it. It's a point of pride for us. But it's really hard. That's a really good question, actually. With Escape, because we pour Escape and friction in-house, we have a lot of control over the quality and consistency of our dual texture. As soon as the texture starts getting a little matte, we can go and fix that. We can change out the mold. We have a lot of control there. Compare that to, say, like, for other companies that pour out of Aragon or Compex, or even for our Kingdom and working class lines, we don't have that same control over what type of dual texture is put out. So you send in the molds, let's say, or Aragon produces the molds, and they're just going to run that until it's, you know, there's no more usable life. So you can start getting bubbles in there, you can start getting matte finishes, and there's just not much you can do to assure that quality. So we're in a unique position because we do pour in-house and we control everything from the beginning to end of the process, that we can ensure that we have like a consistently high grade dual texture. I see lots of vigorous
Yeah,
nodding.
Martin, as you say, like, how much harder is it? A simple hold like this, this is about the most basic shape. You know, you're just shaping it. It takes a long time to get like the ripples out of it. But as soon as you go into a texture hold, you're gonna at least double the shaping time. You know, double or triple it. And then as soon as you get a like dual texture, like you're 10xing the time. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So it's like, as far as like how much harder is it? It's really easy to bang out an entire line of just like a simple texture. And it's a lot harder to do a simple texture with like a layer on top of it. And then when you get to dual texture, you're looking at a whole other time and money investment. And so that's why it's like a dual texture line, like they're really slow to release. Like we only release so many a year because like it's really time intensive, as you know, and we know.
it's a good question. Any other deep, burning questions about holds or textures?
Ergonomics.
The ergos.
So like when shaping, I'm imagining that for some holds, like
I'm popular.
the
Sure.
thought of like how it's going to be gripped is really taken into account for some. Because obviously these holds are really comfortable for like hands, as you guys mentioned. So does that influence how a hold is shaped? More so than that? Because I think we could probably agree, like, the orange jug, that's a really comfortable hold as opposed to like the pinch, for instance, in terms of how they handle it. I don't know.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, I was basically trying to get to like how much is the idea of how a hand is going to grip the hold, like how much does that influence the shape? Is that like the sole basis of the shape, or are there other factors that can go in, like just mimicking like a natural texture, like with the white one? I'm just kind of curious about like the shaping process. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, where's the inspiration for it?
The aesthetic is an aspect of it, or I'm sorry, the ergonomics is one aspect of it. So like you can have an ergonomic pinch, and that's really just about that radius right here.
Okay.
And then how much it humps, like this is flat. You could round it more so it like really fits into your hand,
Yep.
like the whole radius. But then it might have like a different way that you're gonna heel look at. Or, you know, you can have an ergonomic hold that's this big versus one that's, you know, this long. And so you want to think about like what's the use, how big, and then the ergonomics is just about, you know, that pain and where the pressure points are going to go. And the more you round it, the more you're going to spread out like that, the contact surface on the hand. So it's, I would say it's one of several factors as you're thinking about like the whole, you know, side and how you grab it, how you're going to climb on or off of it.
Yeah, I actually think there's probably more to the ergonomics than what, just in terms of like the radius and where the hands hit, right? So if we think about this hold, one of the things that we want to be really intentional about when we're shaping a jug is to make sure that as you grab it, regardless if you have a big hand, you have a little hand, that your knuckles aren't grinding against the back of the wall, right? So if you look, like my hand has a little bit of clearance there. If my knuckles hit the wall, it's no good. So when we sand this, if we go too far, now we've reduced the ergonomics of that hole. So that's one aspect. We want to make sure that where our hands hit and make contact with the hole is comfortable. Things like this hole, we want to make sure that where the fingers and the thumb are nestling, it's comfortable and it makes sense, and it's not trying to force your hand into a weird grip position that's going to cause pain or injury. One of the things a lot of shapers will do nowadays, and a lot of hole companies will do, is shaping very intentionally left hands and right hands. Things that say, like, this is designed to go for your right hand, and you know that because the thumb catch is in this spot, versus this one is over this way. I think a really good example would be these two holes, which I just randomly grabbed. So this is the ledge series, and so there's a little bit of texture here which is designed as a thumb catch, which encourages you as a setter to set this as a left hand pinch. It's going to feel really good. You could set it with the right hand to force a different type of movement, but the hold at its core will always be best in that orientation. Compare that to the Nemesis pinch, and you see that it has a very certain usable surface here, which if I'm going to use it with my right hand, it's going to be the most comfortable in this way. So if you look at how my hand fits there, it looks really good, it looks right. If I was to flip that and go this way, now this feels really horrible. This feels really wrong. Like it's biting my thumb, it hurts a lot. I could do it with the other hand, and it feels good there, and it feels horrible this way. So as these holes are shaped, there's a lot of intention and thought put into what's the usable surface and which hand and what orientation is it going to actually be taking the hold. So there's a lot to the ergonomics question. That there's just it's such a wide conversation. But across the board, the new movement and setting and shaping is to make sure that we're creating holds that
Oh.
feel good and have a high degree of
Okay.
intentionality behind the design.
Good to see you.